Galatians, we're now at chapter 4. Very quickly coming to the end of Galatians, in chapter 4, starting at verse 8, Paul continues to write, and he says, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather, are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months, seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I've wasted my efforts on you. I plead with you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I became like you. You did me no wrong. As you know, it was because of illness that I first preached the gospel to you. Even though in my illness it was a trial for you. Yet you didn't treat me with contempt or scorn. Instead, you welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Jesus Christ himself. Where then is your blessing of me now? I can testify that if you could have done so, you'd have torn out your eyes and given them to me. Have I now become your enemy by telling you the truth? Those people are zealous to win you over, but for no good. What they want is to alienate you from us, that you may have zeal for them. It's fine to be zealous, provided that the purpose is good. And to be so always, not just when I'm with you. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you, how I wish I could be with you now and change my tone, because I'm perplexed by you. This is the word of the Lord. As we continue in this series on Galatians, we're looking at Paul's primary message. I find he's really quite centered on what his message is to the Galatians, as they are wrestling to know which message to believe. What is the true gospel? Really, it's one of Paul's exclusive themes throughout this book. So we're trying to look at it at some different angles. And Paul is trying to convince them of the gospel that they once heard, but now they're hearing other messages and they're not quite sure which to believe. Last week we kind of talked about it from a dystopia type setting, where they're not sure what is true and who they can believe, because there's so much truth and seemingly true things that have been mixed together. And throughout the letter, Paul is addressing this corrupted message, what he calls the perversion of truth. And what we're going to do today is going to be slightly different as we look at Paul's very frustrated heart as he's dealing with these Galatians. He talks about his heart as though he were a parent who's watching their child struggle. How he's just perplexed, and he's talking about this pain of childbirth, this groaning frustration in his soul as he watches on and he feels, I can't do anything about it, though I'm trying. He says, I'm trying to do something, but I need you to work with me here. So he's frustrated. You know, I remember a time when I was a very small child, seeing the frustration almost in my parents. See, when I was a child, my parents had put me in a children's basketball tournament. It was a league, and we would have our practices throughout the week, and we'd have games on weekends, and by the end of it, we would go to tournament. So my parents, they would take me to practice every week. They would help out when they were able to, when parents needed to get involved. They even found another family in our church who had a basketball hoop, and they bought it from them and they put it in their driveway so that we could practice at home to learn the skills needed for this basketball game. And they helped as much as they could to prepare me. And that's what it was. This practice, this homework was to prepare me for the game when the parents aren't allowed on the court. And they go to the stands. The problem was that I was a child, very small child, very uncoordinated. I would like to think my motor skills are better now than they were back then, because once we got to game time, my parents could do nothing but watch as I would miss my pass, as I would receive a pass and it passes me too, and how I would drop the ball on my foot and it would roll out of bounds, and my parents could do nothing but watch on as I would miss my throws, my passes, even my dribble work was terrible. Think about if you're familiar and you enjoy basketball at all, your stars. I don't really watch it myself, but I know some of the player names, the legends. I know of Kobe Bryant and LeBron James and Michael Jordan, and I know these names, and I've even seen some of their things, and I can tell you that's not what I was like. Every mistake that I made on that court, I can only imagine my parents sitting there watching in horror, though they never told me that. I can imagine how they were probably questioning their investment in this future star. The financial registration costs, the time of taking me to practice and bringing work for that they did themselves, wondering, was all of this investment worth it? The horror in their eyes. And this is a bit of what Paul is feeling as he has been with the Galatians, as he helped raise them up and teach them the gospel. We see in verse 13 that he was the one who first preached the gospel to the Galatians. It was because of an illness I first preached the gospel to you. See, he says that he only stayed with the Galatians because he was sick. And they were the ones who were taking care of him. Now he's feeling perplexed and in pain, but he remembers a time when he was with the Galatians. He was amazed by the Galatians. He says, I was sick and you took care of me. Forget about giving the shirt off your own back. He said, if you could have, you would have given me your very eyes. You would cause yourself severe harm if it made me just a little bit better. He was amazed at the Galatians because he was sick. And that's why he preached the gospel. That's something I could preach about, which we aren't going to do today. But I wonder how many of us would see an illness as a problem. And for sure, it can be an unpleasant time, but for Paul, he had an illness, and he says, it's because of that illness that I first preached the gospel to you. With the circumstance in his life, he said, that kind of sent me down a detour. But I don't think it was a detour, says Paul. Because of that detour, it stopped me from doing what I think I was going to do. But instead, it actually allowed me to preach the gospel to you. See, Paul saw it as an opportunity. It wasn't a detour circumstance. Paul saw it as a God-given course correction. And I could talk a lot about that, but I won't. But I hope that challenges you to think about what are the things in your life God is doing that seems like a detour, but might actually be something that God is hoping to use so that the gospel can be shared with someone else. I'll leave that with you and get back on my focus. He says, I was amazed by you. You took care of me. Your love and your generosity, it's as if I was an angel from God. No, scratch that. It's as if I was Jesus himself. That's the kind of love you gave me. I think as a church, the Galatians, in fact, they weren't even a church at that point. But he says, this is a group of people who knows what it means to value mutual care. That's something that we value as a church. When we hear someone is in pain or in need, we are eager to jump and say, how can we help? And here we read of a church who was very much like that. They knew what it meant to not just care for their friends, but to care for a stranger. But something has changed. All of a sudden, the Galatians are starting to turn away from the gospel, away from the message that Paul had shared. They once cared for Paul, but now they're actually turning their backs on him, and they say, I don't know if we can trust what you told us. Why should we listen to you? Where Paul had once felt hospitality, now he's feeling hostility. And that's what the church is supposed to be, a place of hospitality. But Paul is feeling only hostility. And he says, you were doing great at the beginning in the practice time. You were doing excellent. You were working on your life skills. You're learning the message of the gospel. You were doing great in practice. But now that it's game time, now that I've taken a step back and you're on your own, you're falling apart. We're going to stick with this theme of basketball, and specifically my time in what some say wasn't even basketball to begin with. That I remember when we would practice our drills, especially I remember the passing drills. If you've never been a part of children's basketball, one of the first lessons they teach is that it's a lot faster to get the ball across the court if you pass instead of just trying to dribble it all the way to the end. Now, that's true. So we would practice our passing so we could be a faster team to win the game. And we were fine during the drills, during practice. But then come game time, what do you think happens? Everyone wants the ball for themselves. That's where everyone's looking, at the ball. So you want to be the one to have it. You want to be the one to take the shot, sink the basket, score the point, win the game. And passing just completely falls apart. And that was the interesting thing, though, is none of us wanted to lose. None of us wanted to be the reason the team wasn't winning. We all wanted to win the game. In fact, we all wanted to be good teammates, too. It's just it looks a little bit nicer when you're the teammate who helps push the team to victory by doing it yourself. And because of that attitude, the whole team was falling apart. Every team in the league had that problem. Because we all wanted to be good, we wanted to do the right thing, but we had our priorities wrong. Our focus on what was truly the good thing to do. We were trying to be good in all the wrong ways. I bet if some of those basketball stars were on the court, they could have done it and been just fine with these small children at their knees. But we weren't them. And Paul sees the zeal, the passion that's all around them. In fact, even the Judaizers, this primary party who's been working against Paul, they're zealous, they're passionate about their message. And he says, it's good to be zealous. It's good to have that passion in your heart. The problem is when that passion isn't channeled properly. As little basketball stars hoping to be, we wanted to win, but we were channeling that desire in the wrong way. The Judaizers, they were passionate for God, but they wanted it to be on their terms as they fulfill the law, as they earn God's favor. That's what they wanted to do. Whether or not that passion is being channeled properly can be some of the most difficult things to do. And I wonder, are you zealous in the right places, in the right ways? When I was a child, my zeal was in the wrong place because I wanted to be the star who would sink baskets, not the team player who would pass the ball. For these Judaizers, they were zealous. And they were zealous about a good thing even. I wonder how many of you are so passionate about good things. That's maybe where it gets even more difficult. If you're passionate about a wrong thing, it's easy to say, wait, that's wrong. I need to fix this. I need a change in my life. I'm addicted to this terrible thing. That's not where the Judaizers were. They were passionate about a good thing. The law. Something that shows the heart of God. Something that prepares you for Jesus. But the problem was they took a good thing and they made it the ultimate thing in their life. And that gets a lot harder to recognize when the good thing becomes the ultimate thing. And the Galatians, they were passionate to take care of Paul. But now they're looking around. Their eyes start to wander and they ask themselves, what's really important? What do we want to worship? They were victims of idolatry in the past. These old gods, those things that by their nature are not gods, he says in verse 8. And now you're starting to turn back to those things. Paul's worried they might return to their bad habits. What are the good things that could become ultimate things? We had a wonderful evening last night, and I'm so grateful for that time. But do you know that as a church, we're not here just to have fun? You know, we love to meet in fellowship with one another. We love to do life together, but it's all supposed to be on the foundation of Jesus. That's another value of ours. Not just fellowship, not just participation or mutual care for one another. It's all built on Jesus. We join our lives together to encourage one another, to support one another, and to have a relationship where if we need help, we know that they're there in the name of Jesus. So I'm so glad that we can fellowship. But don't let fellowship become the ultimate thing. It's focused on Jesus, sharing the love of God with one another, sharing the gospel with one another. Don't let the good things become ultimate things. What is the priority in your life? The Galatians struggled with idolatry. That's a word that we don't use very often. Idolatry. We don't use worship outside of church all that much either, do we? These are church words. And there are times where I think we are suffering from idolatry and we don't even recognize it because that's not a word that we use. But shift the language to worship is to prioritize, to value. That's what the word means. And I heard it once said that the best way to learn what someone worships is to look at their expense history and their calendar. What is it they use their resources on? What do they spend their time on? What they prioritize will be very clear. when you see how they spend their time and their money. So you may like Jesus, but is he the priority in your life? If someone were to look at how you spend your time and your money, would they know that you were a Christian? Would they say, oh, this person probably goes to church sometimes? Or would they say, wow, you are clearly very passionate about your faith? The ways that you serve the community, the way you get involved, what you give towards, the way you help people. If you're passionate about God and he's the priority in your life, there's going to be signs of that. And that's very much what the letter of James is all about. He says if your faith is alive and real, people are going to see it. They're going to know it. It takes intentionality, of course. But when you're passionate about something, there's going to be signs. And that's not a message to trick into giving more to the church. It's not about that. You can support and love Jesus, live out your faith any way you want for the most part. But if someone were to look at your life, would they know what you truly value? Paul says, I'm not so sure, to the Galatians. He says, have I wasted my effort on you? I mean, the very fact that you're here listening to this message right now is an incredible thing, and I'm glad you're here. But what happens for the rest of the week? Do you spend time with God in Scripture, in prayer? Do you help others? I've also heard it said that human beings are hardwired to worship. We can't help but worship. And that might sound strange in a secular world, but when we say we can't help but prioritize something, value something, well now, actually, yeah, we do that, don't we? The people who say, sorry, I can't help you move, I have to see this game with real basketball stars. I have to see what's happening. I will work my schedule around this game, this work, whatever it is. We're hardwired to worship. For some of us, it's the people who worship their job, who worship their money. People worship their family and say, no matter what, I must make sure my family is the ultimate thing in my life. That's a tough one. People who prioritize comfort, pleasure. What is your priority? God has hardwired us to worship, but we get to choose what it is we worship. But he made us to worship him, the one who gives life. What are you passionate about? What is your ultimate thing? Verse 18, he says, it's fine to be zealous, provided that the purpose is good. But he doesn't stop there. He says, and to be so always, not just when I'm with you. I fear there are people in the church, not just here, but there are people in the church, aren't there, who like to appear very passionate about Jesus. And they'll come on a Sunday morning. And when people are around, they appear very passionate. But what happens when no one's watching? That's another danger. Paul says it's good to be zealous. If it's a good thing, that's great. But is it really passion if no one is watching? Back to basketball, you could really give your all in team practice when the coach is there. But what do you do when you're at home? Do you look at the basketball hoop at all? I didn't. When no one was watching, I wasn't out there. And it showed. When the coach takes a step back, the parents take a step back, and it's game time. The Galatians were great when Paul was with them. But when game time comes and he steps back, the Galatians started to fall apart. Jesus talks about this too, about the servant who would work diligently. Whether the master was there or not, they gave their all, they poured their heart out. It was their priority. Versus the servant who only works when someone's watching. But the reality is that God is with us, not just when we gather to worship. We worship a God who always sees us, always knows our very hearts. We talk about in Christmas that song, how Santa sees you when you're sleeping, and he knows when you're awake. As a child, I thought that was a little strange, a little creepy. And to hear that God can do a similar thing where he knows your heart. He knows what you're passionate about. He knows when it's real and when it's just for show. And that scares me a bit too. And to be honest, I hope it kind of scares you a bit too. Not to demoralize you, not to make you feel like you're not good enough. It's not about that. But my hope is it encourages you to say, what am I passionate about? It's not to bring you shame that I say that. It's to encourage you to make the most of what is a very precious life that you have been given. Jesus gave himself so that you could live. How are you making the most of that? Do you invest your time and your resources in meaningful ways? Or do you chase after things that will fade away? Because there are times when the parent has to step back, when the coach can only watch, and the game begins. Let's pray.